I will choose 1 from 1,000 and 2 from 10,000, and they will become one. A short sentence, and yet unsettling, because it sounds like selection, like closeness and distance, like a few who find and many who lose. Johannes Tauler, a mystic of the inner path, once wrote, "The human being must turn inward and gather all their powers, so that in the depth of the soul, God may be found." Perhaps the riddle of this saying begins exactly here, not with numbers, not with the chosen, but with human distraction. In this episode on saying 23 of the Gospel of Thomas, we explore why so many people live inwardly divided and why only a few ever become whole. This saying is not about status or belief. It is about an inner condition, about what happens when a person keeps moving but never truly arrives, and about the moment when something inside finally stops, not because life becomes easier, but because continuing like before is no longer possible. It rarely begins dramatically. No rupture, no collapse. It begins in the ordinary, with days that are full, yet remain empty, with tasks that get done, without anything truly reaching you, with conversations where you are present, and yet inwardly elsewhere. A person does not become lost all at once. They scatter. Early on, the Desert Fathers described this state as an illness of the inner life. Evagrius Ponticus spoke of a mind that cannot remain anywhere, that jumps from thought to thought and feels restless the moment it becomes still, not out of malice, but out of exhaustion. Distraction is not a moral failure. It is a condition of separation. You are here, but not gathered. Your body lives in the present, yet your inner life is spread out across expectations, worries, roles, across who you are supposed to be and what you fear to lose. Simone Weil wrote that reality slips away from a person when their attention is fragmented, not because the world disappears, but because the person no longer encounters it fully. Perhaps the saying, with its number 1,000, describes precisely this condition. Not the number of people, but the number of inner voices. Not many bodies, but a divided heart. And whoever lives inwardly scattered does not hear a call, not because they are not being called, but because they never become still enough to perceive it. When the saying speaks of 1,000 and 10,000, a trap lies close at hand. We begin to calculate, to compare, to sort. Yet perhaps this text does not want to be counted at all. Nikolaus of Cusa, the great thinker at the threshold between the Middle Ages and the modern world, wrote that a human being can only come to know God by recognizing how limited their knowledge truly is. He called this learned ignorance. Truth is not reached by clinging to concepts, but by letting go of false certainties. Numbers belong to these concepts. They offer stability, and yet they can deceive. In many ancient texts, numbers are not measuring tools, but images of inner states. They indicate direction, not quotas. 1,000 does not then stand for many people, but for the many within a person, for thoughts that branch out, for desires pulling in different directions, for a life that wants everything at once. 10,000 intensifies this image, not to exclude, but to show how far distraction can reach. Nikolaus of Cusa might have said, "Where a person believes they can grasp everything, they lose access to the One, not because the One is distant, but because it escapes calculation." Perhaps these numbers are not a judgment, but a mirror. They reveal how rare inner gathering has become, how unusual it is for a person not to dissolve into multiplicity, but to remain inwardly centered. The movement of this saying does not lead from many to few. It leads from the many to the one. And this path does not begin with calculation, but with becoming still. The word chosen is often misunderstood. It sounds like a decision from above, like preference, like closeness denied to others. Yet perhaps the emphasis does not lie on being chosen, but on responding. Søren Kierkegaard spoke of the human being as the single individual before God, not absorbed into the crowd, not carried by roles, but addressed in freedom. For him, truth was not a property of a group, but an existential relationship. To be chosen, then, does not happen where someone feels secure, but where someone takes responsibility for what calls them inwardly. Edith Stein, philosopher and thinker of surrender, wrote that a person does not find their vocation by elevating themselves, but by opening themselves, not through self-assertion, but through readiness. This perspective changes everything. Chosen is not the one who feels special. Chosen is the one who responds, the one who pauses when life urges them onward, the one who listens when distraction grows louder, the one who does not flee when an inner question arises. Perhaps being chosen is not a state, but a moment, an instant in which a person says, "I take this call seriously, even if I do not know where it will lead." And precisely for that reason, being chosen is not a privilege. It is a demand, because it takes away the excuse to lose oneself in the many. Here, the saying reaches its inner core. They will become one. Not higher, not more powerful, not removed from the world, but one. This unity does not mean that the human being dissolves into God, not that boundaries disappear, or that the human being loses itself. It points to something grounded, and at the same time, profound. A person ceases to be inwardly divided. Carl Jung, who explored the depths of the human psyche, saw the greatest suffering of the human being not in a lack of knowledge, but in inner fragmentation. He wrote that a person does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by becoming conscious of their own darkness. Unity, then, does not arise through escape, not through ideals, not through spiritual elevation, but through truth, through enduring what is contradictory within, through acknowledging what has been repressed, through bringing together what has long lived apart. Romano Guardini emphasized that a person is only truly ordered when their inner life no longer works against itself. Not everything has to be resolved, but everything is allowed its place. Understood this way, unity is not a state of perfection, but of coherence. A person becomes one when thinking, willing, and acting no longer pull in opposite directions, when they no longer evade themselves, when they stand before God without a mask and without self-contempt. This unity is fragile. It is not permanent. It may come and it may go again. But where it does occur, something decisive changes. A person no longer lives against themselves. When a person becomes inwardly gathered, something happens that does not come from themselves, not as a feeling, not as an insight, but as a quiet shift within. The mystics do not speak of effort here, but of space. Isaac of Nineveh wrote that God does not work where a person strains themselves, but where they become inwardly still, where they no longer cling to everything, where they stop defending themselves. Unity then means this: a person is no longer alone within themselves. They remain the same, with questions, with weakness, with restlessness, and yet something carries them. Not visible, not tangible, and yet real. This unity does not first reveal itself in doing, but in being. A person no longer has to constantly prove who they are. They no longer have to compare themselves, to justify themselves, to harden themselves, because they remain inwardly connected. Johannes Tauler spoke of this, that where a person turns inward and gathers their powers, God Himself works within. Not spectacularly, not overwhelmingly, but in a way that brings order. This order does not come from control, but from closeness, and so life begins to change, not through outward success, but through inner steadiness. A person remains open without losing themselves. They act without tearing themselves apart. They suffer without becoming inwardly impoverished, not because they are strong, but because they are being carried. Being chosen does not happen where a person feels special, not in knowledge, not in strength, not in the feeling of having arrived. It happens quietly, there, where a person becomes inwardly still without knowing why, where they no longer have to hold on to everything, where they stop working against themselves. The mystics do not speak of decision here, but of touch. It is not the human being who reaches for God. It is God who touches the human being in their restlessness. Dag Hammarskjöld wrote, in essence, that the human path does not consist in realizing oneself, but in entrusting oneself to what is greater than oneself. Being chosen is then not an ascent, but a release, a moment in which a person realizes that they no longer have to be carried, because they have been carried all along. Perhaps it happens precisely there, where a person pauses, not by their own strength, but because something within them calls them into rest, not loudly, not forcefully, but clearly enough to remain. The 1 out of 1,000 are not a group, not a circle, not a movement. They are individual people who, if only for a moment, allow themselves to be held. This saying is not about belonging to the few. It is about not remaining scattered, not having to understand everything, not having to categorize everything, not having to hold yourself together, but about making space for what is greater than you. Perhaps unity does not begin with an answer, not with a decision, not with a resolution, but with the courage to allow yourself to be held.